Hello and hi, welcome to another video tutorial on concepts of cost and management accounting. In today's video tutorial, we will be talking about elements of cost. So far in our journey, we've been discussing management and cost accounting. We've spoke in detail about the advantages, the functions of cost accounting. We've learned the different categorizations, the different classifications of cost. We've also learned about the different costing methods. In this particular video tutorial, we would be going into the depths to understand what are the elements of cost. Now, from a cost accounting point of view, there are three elements of cost: material, labor, expenses. Now, what are these elements of cost? Elements of cost are used in differentiating and bifurcating cost. In other words, these are categorizations, these are classifications that we use in terms of segregating cost. Now, the elements of cost helps us in going about with the recording of costs as and when they occur, as and when they take place in an organization. So with the help of these elements of cost, we go about with the various reporting and the analysis activities from a subject point of view. Now, with the help of the elements of cost, the management would be able to go about controlling the cost in a better way. So once these costs gets categorized into the various elements, it becomes a lot easier for the management to try and understand which element of cost do they need to focus on. So all the necessary data that is needed by the management, it gets supplied with the help of these three elements of cost. So once again, the three elements of cost are material, labor, and expenses. Now, what is interesting is that each of these elements can be further classified into direct and indirect. Now, let's dive deep into understanding each of these elements in detail. The first element that we would be talking about is the material cost. Now, what is material cost? Material cost is the cost of commodities supplied into an undertaking. That is what we call as material cost. So in other words, material cost is the cost that you spend for the raw material, or it is the commodity that gets used up as a part of your activities in the organization. What we have to remember is, in the due process of your production activity, in the due process of your business activity, these material gets consumed or it gets used up. So as we had seen earlier, each of these elements of cost can be further classified into direct and indirect. So we can have direct material, we can have indirect material. Now, what is direct material? These are raw materials which are integral part of your production activities. So depending on the level of activity, level of production activity that you carry out, the consumption of direct material would vary. So an example would be wood that you use for manufacturing furniture, or it could be the cloth that you use for carrying out your stitching activities. So all these are examples of direct material. Now, the next categorization that we have under the element of material is indirect material. Indirect material may not form an integral part of your finished product. However, it is very difficult for you to complete the production activity without the indirect material as well. So we could look at an example: nails which are used in manufacturing furniture, or we could think of the example of buttons or threads which is used as a part of your stitching activity. So these are examples of indirect material. The next element of cost is labor cost. What is labor cost? Labor cost refers to the remuneration that gets paid to the employees who are working in your organization. So labor is the remuneration. It is the expense that you incur for employing the workforce which is needed in converting the material into finished goods. Now, what we have to remember is the labor cost is equivalent to the proportion of your total or overall cost. It forms a major component. Now, what we have to also remember is, here we need to pay a fair compensation to these labor, and it gets ensured by the law. So there are different laws that are passed, depending on these laws, you need to pay a fair compensation. Now, this compensation would depend on a number of factors. It could be depending on the quality of work. It could be depending on the number of hours that you would be spending at work. So, depending on all this, you would end up incurring the labor cost. Labor cost can be further classified as direct and indirect. Now, let's talk about the element of labor in detail. So, direct labor refers to the cost that you incur for employees who are an integral part of your manufacturing process. So, these employees are needed to ensure that your manufacturing process is taking place in a smooth way. We can think of an example of a college. At the college, there are teachers who will be working in different departments, but the department may not be able to function. The college may not be able to function without the help of these teachers. Then we have indirect labor. Indirect labor is the compensation that you pay for employees who are not a direct part of your manufacturing activity. Now, they are needed as support function. They are needed as support personals to ensure that they are there to assist the direct laborers to ensure a smooth functioning. We could think of the example of college. So the employees who are working in the payroll department, they also need to be paid salary. So the salary that gets paid out to them will be an example of indirect labor. Let's talk about expenses, which is the last element. Now, any expense, any cost that cannot be classified as material or labor, it would get classified as an expense. So this is the cost of service provided to an undertaking, or the cost that is that you need to pay for the use of an owned asset. Now, the cost of service that is provided to an organization is what you call as expenses. Now, these expenses are incurred to provide support to the existing production activity. So we have the example of food, which is provided to the laborers working in a factory. This can be further classified as direct or indirect. Again, we can have direct expenses. Now, direct expenses, you would be able to identify them directly with a process. So such kind of costs are called as direct expenses. We could think of the example of repair charges that you incur when your machinery breaks down. Then you could have indirect expenses. These may not be associated. These you may not be able to tag exclusively to a process. However, these are costs that you would still be incurring. We have the example of telephone expenses. So with that, we've come to the end discussion of the elements of cost. A quick recap: there are three elements: material, labor, and expenses. Each of these elements can be further classified into direct and indirect. So with that, we've come to the end of this video tutorial.